Welcome to Unlearning Ignorance, a podcast where once a month we discuss a commonly divisive issue and attempt to fairly represent multiple perspectives. We are not experts, nor are we neutral. Our goal is to show an accurate understanding of conflicting sides, in hopes that it will foster civil conversations with an attitude of always learning. But we also want the show to represent you. So every month we will have a response episode where we highlight your comments, emails, tweets, and voicemails, telling us what we got terribly right, incredibly wrong, or something in between. Thanks for listening to this month's episode, where we bring together Vox Populi, the voice of the people. Welcome to the Unlearning Ignorance podcast. My name is Ethan Hicks, and this is my co-host, Chase Tremaine.
Pew pew.
How you doing, Chase? Yeah. Just pew pew.
I did.
That's aggressive. That's very aggressive language, and you need to calm that down.
It feels offensive for the topic we'll be discussing today.
Yeah, kind of like minimizing. There's a hashtag pew pew that goes around. I see sometimes, and it's he's promoting this guy. He's promoting this. His name's Colion Noir, and he's promoting the idea that there are good guys and bad guys who use guns. And so pew pew, hashtag pew pew, I think is one he uses every now and then to harken back to the cops and robbers days of our youth, when we used to play like, oh, hey, they're clearly good guys and clearly bad guys, and we can make black and white distinctions as kids, so we need to enforce that culturally.
I've been watching the How to Train Your Dragon films a lot lately. Like some of them multiple times. I've been thinking about them a lot. And the second one in particular has this funny subtext that I doubt was intentional. And it was pointed out to me by a film critic named Perry Seibert. But it's kind of like this underlying message in the second How to Train Your Dragon movie. That's basically, dragons don't kill people. People kill people.
Oh man, now I gotta watch it. I like the first one.
Yeah.
Apparently I need to watch the sequel.
Yeah. Obviously, that introduces our topic for today. Gun control.
Yeah.
Where we are going to take different sides on the gun control debate, but have a good conversation about it.
Yeah, be very civil and kind to the other side, with the underlying understanding that we all want less people to die in horrific, violent ways. And how do we best go about that is kind of the underlying, like, we're assuming this, what's it called? The underlying... The
presupposition?
Presupposition, yeah. The presupposition is that we both believe this, and now how do we go about having less people die from guns? I will be taking the pro-gun side of this discussion and really emphasizing the idea that guns provide a freedom to not be reliant on the state to protect you, to be not relying on some outside authority that maybe you have to wait for to come, and it enables you to protect yourself if something extremely bad was to go wrong around you. If somebody is threatening you, the people you love around you, you are able to prevent that bad actor from harming yourself or others around you. And
there aren't two simple sides here. Obviously, the pro-gun side can go all the way to the extreme of free access to buying and owning any types of guns. We won't be able to cover the full spectrum of that position, but we're going to try to at least cover a wide spectrum of those positions on both sides. My side for this conversation being the pro-gun control philosophy, which I think would go all the way to the extreme in America of removing all guns from citizens and getting rid of the Second Amendment.
And so the distinctions between them is like, should you be empowering the individual to protect themselves, or is the individual incapable of protecting in providing the most protection for everybody, and the state needs the empowerment to seek out those bad actors and prevent them from hurting other people?
Well, yeah, and there's I don't think it's whether the citizen is incapable. I think it's rather by equipping the citizen, are we equipping just as many criminals as we are equipping the ones who will have crimes committed against them?
Right. It does does the freedom have more cost in a cost benefit analysis? Is it more costly for society on the whole to empower the individual, or is it more costly on society as a whole to empower the state? Like,
Yes.
does more violence happen when you empower the individual versus empowering the state? So
But give me the
yeah,
what and the why of your position. Like, what's your position and why would you hold it?
the pro gun position is that everybody should have the ability and access to guns to defend themselves. Everyone who everyone is capable of having extreme violence inflicted on them from guns, and so they should have the ability for self-defense. It's the intrinsic self-defense ability, taken that because of the reality that there are guns in the world, you should be able to fight back a gun with a gun. That because there are because the bad actors have access to guns, we should also have access to guns to defend ourselves from those bad actors.
Right. It's like taking the advice of don't bring a knife to a gunfight and enacting that for an entire nation.
Exactly. And when you do that, the reason it is such a powerful argument is because it takes time for the police to respond. Anywhere from 5 to 10 minutes to 30 minutes. It's you are alone and something bad is happening very quickly. Cannot wait on somebody else to defend yourself. Everybody you love could be dead, and the bad actor has run away, has gotten away, and you are you may be dead yourself. And so empowering the individual to protect themselves and protect against bad actors, but also protecting you from a tyrannical government. So the Second Amendment mentions
Right.
for the protection of freedom from militia, a well-regulated militia. And so I butchered that quote, but it's the idea is that the state can become tyrannical, and individuals need to be ability to stand up against a tyrannical government. Like a great example is the Black Panther movement in California. They were being heavily discriminated against, and the government was being very authoritative and abusing their power. And so the Black Panthers came out with their firearms and started patrolling their own streets to let the authorities know the bad that were abusing their authority, that they were there and they were watching. If they saw somebody abusing their authority, that they would act.
So my position on the pro control side would be, I think, largely based on what we see in comparison uh, of America to other nations, and seeing how while America might not have higher crime rates than other nations because of our large amounts of uh, guns, we do have a larger rate of violent crime. And you can point to examples such as Australia, that after a buyback of all semi-automatic guns, there was a huge drop in violent crime that wasn't just a short-term effect. It has sustained since the buyback in the 90s. And people who support greater gun control laws in America, the idea is that like change needs to happen with the mass shootings that we see. Um, it feels like they're happening more and more, and like every time we get over one, another one happens. That something needs to be done to be keeping guns out of the hands of dangerous people, and through better laws and better systems in place to keep people from getting guns who shouldn't be getting guns, and to put regulations on private gun purchasing that can make a huge shift in the availability and access to guns in our nation to help keep the violent crime rates down, all the way to the extent of saying that if we remove as many guns from our society as possible, then we are removing the main weapon that's used in violent crimes.
A great consistent argument I would see in that is that by implementing a kind of Australia-like buyback, which is a mandatory buyback, you would need to remove the Second Amendment and essentially say, we are buying back all these guns. If you do not sell your gun in the buyback, we will forcibly take it from you.
Right.
And that eventually will lead to less gun violence. I emphasize the gun on gun violence there, because I do not think it will lead to less violence. But if you if your end goal is less gun violence, that is your absolute perfect route to take by eventual less gun violence. Because once you remove the Second Amendment and you do the buyback, at the end of the buyback period, there are going to be people who did not sell their guns back, and they will be breaking a federal law, and you will need to use guns from the police state, from the people enforcing this law, to go into those people's homes and forcibly remove those people, forcibly arrest those people and remove the guns. And so and I can guarantee you, knowing the gun culture, there will be a lot of gun violence in that removal.
Sure.
They will not go quietly into the night, kind of thing.
I have 2 points of pushback there. I think one, there would be a decrease in violence a lot, because so much of the violence around guns is incidental, whether that you weren't planning on using it at all, or that it causes far greater damage than intended.
Proportionally, what are you talking? You think it's the most, or you think it's just a plurality? Like there's kind of a large portion.
It's not a large portion, but the amount of gun violence deaths that happen through unintentional shootings, to remove that would be a benefit. But also, we're talking not necessarily about removing all guns, but removing the most dangerous ones. Of course, from my side of the issue, there are some people who are saying, let's get rid of the Second Amendment and all guns with it. You would not have to get rid of the Second Amendment to do an Australian-style buyback for a specific type of gun, to let people keep their pistols and Glocks, but to take their semi-automatics or their rifles or whatever.
You are correct that you can make the distinguishing between a handgun and a rifle to a certain point. So when you're talking about mechanically, that line between handgun and rifle can get a little blurry, because you're talking about lengths of barrel, shoulder, stocks, how they bump up against your shoulder, and whether or not those are bad. The thing that already happened that is declared is implicitly constitutional, because it's not been technically ruled on in the court, is the automatic semi-automatic. So the automatic has a very clear functional distinction from the semi-automatic, in that automatic is you hold down the trigger and the gun fires until you let go of that trigger. Whereas semi-automatic, it's one trigger pull per round. So you only get one round comes out for every trigger pull. And the next slower down on that is bolt, where you pull the trigger and you have to manually put the next bullet in to pull the trigger again. So when you say we would need to remove the Second Amendment, we wouldn't need to remove it to do an Australian-style buyback. I don't think that's possible. I don't think that's true, actually.
Okay.
I think the distinction between rifle and handgun is uh, so gray that it would be very very unlikely for that to not be contested in the courts and as an infringement upon the Second Amendment. And second, we should talk about what. So if we're not talking about end of all gun violence, taking away all guns, then we're gonna start getting into what is the largest proportion of how guns are used to commit violence. The largest is suicide. It's personal harm that people intentionally do to themselves. That's the largest portion. The next one is violence with handguns. Handguns in places like Chicago, lots of drug and gang related activity is where most of the violence is done. So if you're thinking that an Australian style buyback of rifles is going to reduce most of the violence, it's just not reflected in reality in America. Because if your end goal is reducing violence, violent crime, why with guns, why are you not focusing on handguns instead of rifles, where it does the proportionally least amount of violence?
All right. So, and there is an interesting question there of, does the Second Amendment say the right to bear any arms?
Mm-hmm.
Because it's not any arms, and when the Bill of Rights was drafted, there was no way of knowing what weapons would be developed. And so, if we don't put some sort of limitations on what all the Second Amendment means, like, what could that potentially mean in the future as new weapons are created, as smaller weapons are created, as more easily hid weapons are created?
3D printed comes to mind, yeah.
Right. So, I think there should be something put in place so that the Second Amendment can't mean an umbrella for all types of handheld weapons.
Mm-hmm.
There should be limits on that. And you already said, like, there have been limits put on the assault rifle. Or, sorry, no, the automatic. You said the automatic.
Automatic, yeah. Automatic, you need a federal license to get an automatic gun.
So making that move, just continuing that direction, I think incrementally could put a slow forward motion in a direction of making Americans safer and getting rid of weapons that there's no need for citizens to have, even for, like, hunting.
The pushback on that is, we've been doing that. Like, that's something that's happening. In Heller, Scalia, I believe he wrote the majority opinion on that. He clearly stated that the Second Amendment means an individual right to bear arms, but that does not mean that all of the current laws infringing, or quote unquote infringing, or controlling that right are unconstitutional. That there are constitutional restrictions, just like freedom of speech. There are consequences for yelling fire in a crowded theater, and so there are consequences and controls and restrictions on guns that are allowed, even though it is a fundamental constitutional right. So the Constitution, as interpreted right now in the Supreme Court, follows what you said, in that it does not give a universal everybody should have guns. And as far as what you're talking about, the distinction, at least I'm going to go back to what you said about the founders when they wrote that. Like, we don't take that approach to any other fundamental right outlined in the Constitution. Like, freedom of speech is a notable, like, there's no way they could have thought of Twitter, like, and yet we include that as, like, hey, people will need to be free to say what they want to say on Twitter, at least as the government's concerned. Not talking about the Twitter of the company censoring, but the government should not be able to restrict the content of the speech of people talking on social media or the internet because we have this fundamental right of freedom. And so it doesn't, using that conception of gun, that they couldn't imagine the types of guns we would have now, even though they did have automatic guns when they wrote that. There were automatic guns being used at that time. That doesn't mean that fundamental right outlined is not adaptable to the modern world.
But so there is, and I disagree with you to an extent. I think the adaptability goes along with the intended principle, which of course, like, this isn't, widely agreed upon. Even on the Supreme Court, you have people who are strict textualists and people who are not. People who are trying to interpret the text based on the original intentions, and people who are willing to adapt the text to fit the here and now. The freedom of speech is adaptable to Twitter without them having to have imagined it. And so
why?
What?
No. That's a fundamental presupposition that you're spouting that I disagree with. You can't, like, using the argument they couldn't imagine guns, they couldn't imagine Twitter.
They can imagine communication, right? They can imagine why they made the First Amendment, to let us be able to say what we choose to say and the government not having control over that. Twitter is just newspaper clippings and headlines in internet form. It doesn't change language and people expressing themselves. Guns, on the other hand, like, the principle of the Second Amendment is not gun ownership. The principle of the Second Amendment is suitable self-defense and self-protection. I would argue that the principle from the Second Amendment is not to continue giving people access to the newest, biggest, baddest guns. It's to give people access to what can keep them safe in their home.
Okay, so let's dive into that, and where we'll find some agreement is the lines. Where is the line? The Second Amendment guarantees personal defense, and what type of weapon is where we're now talking about. So let's draw a line. So clearly, nobody needs a nuke, right, for personal defense.
Right.
So how do we define where the line is without getting too specifically technical? I like the line of, you should be able to, it should not be a area of wound infliction. So it should be able to be one target at a time. Like, automatic and semi-automatic, I think, is a great line there, because automatic, you're holding it down, and it's naturally harder to control than a single pull. So the automatic lends itself to an area, a spread of damage, whereas semi-automatic lends itself towards control, firing one bullet at one person at one target. And I think that's a pretty clear and distinct line that we should uphold as a defense.
So, on your perspective, the semi-automatic is something that should stay in the hands of U.S. citizens?
Absolutely.
Okay. So, in terms of who has access to these guns, what do you think about the current processes and laws being used for being able to attain a gun? Going through a background check before buying your semi-automatic.
The fundamental, my fundamental is everyone with exceptions. So exceptions like 18. You got to be an adult to buy a gun, and 18 seems to be a good common age. Federal background checks, those are good standards that we already have.
Sure.
To buy from a licensed dealer, those are good rules to have. And so the federal background check would prevent violent criminals, I think, from owning guns. And I want to make that distinction in that there's a lot of non-violent criminals who I think are going back into violent areas that should be able to protect themselves from the violent criminals. And I think those are kind of distinctions. They're demonstrable and evidentiary distinctions that limit enough people that are provably trying to do harm, have been proven to try to do harm. It will allow, like what we've seen in mass shootings, school shooters, the person who exhibited no prior demonstration, like Las Vegas shooter, had no prior demonstrations of intentions of violence on people until it happened. And that is an unfortunate consequence of freedom. And it's
that the freedom to do good allows the freedom to do evil.
Yes.
So is there anything from your side that you think we can do to help try to prevent those situations?
I mean, we do that. I think we do
anything
what we can, which is make murder illegal.
Do you think, is there anything from your side that isn't being done that could be done to help?
Okay, intergovernmental communication. There's the problem of a federal background check might not check locally because the local hasn't reported to a common database. So a common database of criminal offenders, of violent criminal offenders, would I think help.
Right. So
that's not being done.
On that topic, are you aware of the holes currently in place in the background checks through the FBI? That there are a lot of people who should get flagged that don't?
Not on a specific level.
To my understanding,
I don't quite understand what you're asking. Yeah, what have you heard?
To my understanding, in doing research for this episode specifically, there are some states where it's voluntary to give that information to the FBI.
From local agencies, yes. Right. And that's what I'm talking about.
Right.
It should be mandatory for violence to be reported to the FBI. I agree with that. Intergovernmental communication and red tape is handicaps a lot of laws, including gun laws.
Yeah, and I think another, and this is hard, and I don't think there's really anything from your side that can be done for this, but with so many violent crimes being with the use of guns, there are a lot of people getting their first guns who haven't committed a crime yet. Mm-hmm. And the crime comes after the gun purchase.
Yeah, and that's just the reality of the world. Like, you can't... The idea that you would be able to read somebody's mind when they're buying a gun is foolhardy.
Sure.
Is a fantasy world.
So, but where would be your stance on like the mental health issues and the idea of doing psychological tests before being able to purchase a gun?
It is a very dangerous road to go down because in passing, you can say, oh, there's clearly these people, they're taking these medications and committing these crimes, kind of thing. But does ADHD count as a mental health disorder? Like, where you're drawing the line in a very new science that is psychology, where using that as a concrete distinction to fundamentally deprive somebody of their constitutional right to own a gun is way too gray of a science, way too arbitrary. And there could be a system of appeals to appeal that, but I think it is very shaky road to go down to have a psychological test to buy a gun, because the questions could be worded in a weird way, and red flags could be set up when there shouldn't be red flag. The false red flags, depriving of somebody of the right to own a gun is very very troubling, because it will, all these control will eventually impact the most vulnerable. I talk about I mentioned the Black Panthers in California.
Sure.
In response to the Black Panthers, California enacted open carry gun control, so you couldn't open carry, and it fundamentally curtailed those who were most vulnerable in the community. They were owning guns because they were vulnerable. People buy guns because they know and learn to use guns because they know they're vulnerable in where they're at. And so when you're trying to curtail those people's access to guns, you're going after those minority communities that are most vulnerable. I keep using that. Will be hardest hit by these control acts.
And so at this point in American society, do you think that we really should be concerned about like a militia going against the people? Of like, if we in an attempt to stop crime, put more soldiers on the streets or more police officers, whatever it is. Do you think that would be a threat to our freedom?
So I think a tyrannical government is a very real threat, and I think a lot of people woke up to that idea when Trump was elected. That a lot of people who said, "Oh, don't worry, the government's never really gonna turn on us," kind of thing. They saw somebody who they view as
cuckoo,
crazed, kind of, very irrational, and they were scared. And over the years, America has given so much of the power of the people to its government, to its specifically to the executive office. The power of the government is more than it's ever been in the history of America, which is the nature of it, to monopolize power. And so the power of the executive office scared so many people that they were right to fear tyranny. And so it's clearly not irrational to fear tyranny. So then the next part of your question is, will militias push up against it? With a common argument is the government has so much military weapon, it has so much military power, that what's your little pew-pew rifle going to do against it?
Sure.
And one, I would ask, so if the Constitution guarantees me defense against the government, why aren't you giving me those military-style weapons? But then if we're going to agree not to have the citizenry do that, we look at, say, Afghanistan or Vietnam. The attacking force, invading force, was way technologically superior. They had tanks, drones. Drones in the second one, not the first, obviously. Drones in the first, not the second, obviously. But aircraft. Yet this defending local force with less technology beat them. They lost. Yeah. America lost Vietnam, and it was pretty effective. ISIS defeating America they're still alive. Like, they're still being defeated. Like, local insurgencies and are beating back America, in that we're pulling out now. And so
that smaller point.
Smaller militias beating the big bad slow moving military of America has been demonstrated throughout the decades.
Yeah. And I will concede for sure that to take perhaps the extreme side of having the government remove all guns, or even to do a buyback, would one put us in the very scary position of the government having all the guns, and like what are they going to do with them?
Mm-hmm.
In Australia, all the semi-automatics that were collected were destroyed. That's probably would be the story, but if we were up against a tyrannical government that tried pulling a move like that, it would probably be something far more insidious. And then the other thing is that, and you mentioned this earlier, that when the guns are taken back, the people who wouldn't give up their guns or would manage to keep them, hide them, stay undercover, that in itself incriminates those people and makes them criminals. But that decision to not to would most likely be made by people who already were criminals or already had criminal intention.
Mm-hmm.
Then you would have the potentially most dangerous people in society being the ones with the guns, and the compliant citizens being the ones left defenseless. But I still think a plan could be implemented with the goals of moving in that direction rather than doing something so immediate and extreme that would put the common citizen at such a stark disadvantage and put them in such a place of unsafety.
Okay, so if that's what you're pushing, then that's your goal. It has been the violent crime in America has gone down since the late 90s, and the amount of guns have gone up. I'm not saying that's a causation that more guns equals less crime, but more guns clearly doesn't equal more violence, more violent crime. So what is the end goal? When will you know? Okay, we've done enough in the law area to stop. Now we can focus more on the societal, the mental health, not that those are mutually exclusive, but why are we not at the end goal in the law area and just should focus on implementing the laws we have? And why do we need more? When will we know we don't need more laws?
For my side, I think the end goal is removing the option of gun violence, especially when we mentioned that the biggest problem, and this is a very separate issue than violent crime, and I recognize that, but it's not entirely separate from gun control laws. The biggest thing that happens is suicide. It's people taking their own lives with guns rather than one another's. And to keep gun laws in place, and even to support the individual ownership of guns in any regular citizen's household, is giving someone who struggles with suicidal thoughts or struggles with depression or just has a really terrible day, putting the option right in front of them of how to use that gun, in a way that by removing the gun, you're removing that option.
But you're not removing their ability to commit suicide.
Right. And so this leads to a completely separate conversation of human nature and the fact that we do what we want to do. And so if you want to commit violence against yourself or others, eventually, like, if that's really what you want, you find a way.
Yep.
However, I think suicide is a particular issue that often happens in just like a fleeting moment of passion, that one small motion and you've made a decision that can't be taken back, and you can't think about it, you can't change your mind, it's just done. Versus to remove one of the easiest ways to do this, then so many other ways give you more time of reflection, more time to rethink it, more time for someone else to get involved.
I will concede that it is possible that suicides will go down dramatically if they didn't have access to a gun, because, as you said, it is easier to commit suicide with that. But protecting people from themselves shouldn't omit me being able to protect me from others or my family from others. And the idea that you can predict somebody's suicidality, possibility of suicide after they bought a gun, being totally mentally stable and not having thoughts at all, the possibility down the road, everybody has the possibility of mental health problems, of suicidal thoughts, and those may not always be shown when they're buying the gun. And it goes back to, it's such a gray area that it is way more problematic for you to give up your protection from bad actors who will still have guns, even if you take the good guys' guns away, to prevent that option for suicide. It is an option. It is not the, oh, we take all the guns away, suicide goes away. Japan is a great example. There is a suicide forest where people go to hang themselves, to kill themselves. And it's at alarming rates. And the rate is not going to go down, even though Japan has tremendous gun control. Then why are you implementing this barrier for somebody who wants to protect the weakest, the most vulnerable from doing so?
I don't know.
And I will also note, we keep saying violence with guns, because violence is also protecting somebody, right? I will use violence to protect me, to protect my family. Somebody is using illegal violence to harm me. We want to promote legal violence and prevent illegal violence. The legal violence is used a lot, and it doesn't get reported a lot, about how people use guns to protect themselves.
Right, basically making the distinction of good violence per se, in that sometimes the only way to end violence is with violence.
Right, which all gun control proponents fundamentally concede that even if you want all the citizenry to not have guns, you still want the government to have guns. Like, you want somebody to use that violence on the people who intend to do harm, and you just don't want to have your fellow neighbor to have that violence potential to protect themselves.
So I'm not sure actually and this is something on a more personal level that I've struggled with for a very long time, is where I fall on the using violence to stop violence thing. But on a lighter note, do you remember the 2005 film Man of the House starring Tommy Lee Jones?
Oh, I like had buried that in my mind, and I didn't have to think about that ever again until you just brought it up. So yes,
it's a Texas Ranger who's protecting a group of cheerleaders. And early on in the movie, they're talking to him and saying, like, why do you have to shoot to kill? You know, like, if someone has a gun aimed at you, why don't you just, like, shoot at their hand or shoot at their gun instead of trying to shoot them? And the movie ends with, like, a bad guy on the scene, and Tommy Lee Jones' character shoots the gun out of his hand because of what the cheerleaders taught him. That's it. I really wanted to bring this movie up in this episode. I couldn't stop thinking about
Such a terrible movie.
On Rotten Tomatoes, the film has an approval rating of 9%.
Yes. In fact, that is too high. I would say that's twice as high as it should be.
Well,
it is
4.5% isn't a thing on. Okay.
I may be a little biased in that I had a very bad date when I went to see that movie, but I still agree. That is a terrible movie. Now I want to talk about how unrealistic it is for somebody to shoot a gun out of the hand in a tense situation, and how that's just
Oh yeah, you're supposed to aim for like the most amount
biggest target.
biggest target. Yeah, that's why you aim for the torso, not for the legs. You'll very likely to miss.
And endangers everybody else around. Anyways, yeah, that's a good place to end. I think this one will have a lot of adamant feedback, I would say.
Yeah, and
lots of people.
This is such a spectrum. Like there are people who have very specific ideas of how to reform gun law, how to change the laws in place, how to make the background checks more thorough, more intensive. And it's stuff that can't be covered in a 40-minute podcast. But if you do think that we got anything terribly wrong, or anything that we said could be nuanced, or new evidence could be brought to the table, new information, please feel free to hit us up. We are on all the social medias. I think you created a Reddit for us, a subreddit.
Yeah, there's a subreddit. There's a Facebook page. We have a voicemail that has the number of
972-885-9574. And of course, the main purpose of the voicemails is so that you can appear later this month on our response episodes, where we will come back on for a shorter episode to talk about what you've said, things we've learned since recording the show, new information, new perspectives. And if you would like to have your voice heard actually on that episode, then please leave us a voicemail and we can hear from you. So again, our voicemail number is 972-885-9574.
Yeah. And we really want to have a very constructive civil conversation on this. We feel like the sides speak past each other on this issue specifically a lot, and we want to have a good dialogue where people learn and are understood by the other side, even if we disagree.
Right.
So thanks everybody for listening.
Yeah, we don't want each other's opinions and perspectives to pass by each other like bullets going between legs.
Oh, okay. That's that was such a reach.
I know.
Such a reach. All right.
Thank you for listening to this month's episode, but the conversation isn't over yet. We want to hear from you. What did we get right or wrong, and what's your perspective on the issue? By writing in, your feedback can be featured in the response episode we will publish later this month. Email us at unlearninignorance@gmail.com, tweet us at unignorancepod, or leave a voicemail at 972-885-9574. Again, that's 972-885-9574. And by lending your voice to the conversation, you can help this podcast represent the Vox Populi, the voice of the people. Thanks for tuning in to Unlearning Ignorance, and we'll be back next month with another divisively divisive issue.